3 words. That's all it took for Johnny Carson to end a man's career and change television history. Not on my show. October 14, 1983. Comedian Frank Dalton was killing it on The Tonight Show. The audience loved him. The jokes were landing. Then Frank spotted a black man in the third row and decided to make him part of the act. The joke was the kind that had been acceptable in comedy clubs for decades. The kind that got easy laughs by punching down. The kind that Johnny Carson had heard 1,000 times from 1,000 comedians. But something was different that night. Maybe it was the look on the man's face. Maybe it was the way some audience members laughed too hard, too eagerly. Maybe Johnny was just tired of pretending he didn't hear what he heard. Whatever it was, when the laughter started, Johnny Carson didn't join in. He stood up from his desk, walked to center stage, and said 3 words that silenced 1,800 people. Not on my show. What followed was 7 minutes of live television that NBC executives wished had never happened. 7 minutes that ended Frank Dalton's career. 7 minutes that a man named James Monroe would later call the moment he realized his dignity mattered to someone other than himself. James Monroe was 34 years old in October 1983. He taught history at a high school in Oakland, California. Grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations were low. Worked his way through college. Became one of the few black teachers at his school. Every night for 15 years, James watched The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was his escape. After long days of teaching, after dealing with a system that often made him feel invisible, James would sit in his small apartment and watch Johnny. The jokes, the guests, the way Johnny could make anyone feel comfortable. James dreamed of seeing the show in person. So, he saved. For 6 months, James put away a little from each paycheck, skipped lunches, took extra tutoring jobs. Finally, in October 1983, he had enough bus ticket to Los Angeles. 2 nights in a cheap motel and a ticket to The Tonight Show taping on October 14th. 3rd row, center section. The best seat James Monroe had ever had for anything. James arrived at NBC Burbank 3 hours early, wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for his mother's funeral 2 years earlier. He wanted to look respectable, wanted to belong in that audience of mostly white faces. When the lights went down and Ed McMahon's voice boomed, "Here's Johnny." James felt like a kid again. Pure joy. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Johnny's monologue was sharp. The first guest, an actress promoting a new film, was charming. James laughed until his sides hurt. Then Frank Dalton walked out. James knew Frank Dalton had seen him on TV before. Edgy comedy, the kind that sometimes made James uncomfortable, but that white audiences seemed to love. Frank started his set with some political jokes, some bits about marriage. The audience was eating it up. Then Frank's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on James. The only black face in the first several rows, Frank pointed directly at James. "Hey buddy, nice suit. Don't worry, I'm not going to accuse you of stealing it." Some audience members laughed nervously. Others laughed hard. James felt his face burn, tried to smile, tried to play along. That's what you did. That's what black men in white spaces had always done. Laugh it off. Don't make a scene. Don't confirm their expectations by getting angry. But Frank wasn't done. "No, seriously, folks. I love it when they dress up. Makes it easier to spot them at night." The laughter got louder. James felt 1,800 pairs of eyes on him. Felt like he was shrinking in his seat. Felt every dollar he'd saved, every mile he'd traveled, every dream he'd had about this night turning to ash. This was 1983. James had experienced racism before many times, but never in a place he'd chosen to be. Never in a place he'd worked so hard to reach. Never while sitting in his funeral suit, just wanting to laugh like everyone else. Johnny Carson wasn't laughing. James noticed it through his humiliation. While the audience roared, Johnny sat very still behind his desk. His face was unreadable. When Frank paused, waiting for the laughter to die down before his next joke, Johnny stood up. The movement was so unexpected that the audience went quiet. Johnny Carson didn't stand up during guest performances. It simply wasn't done. Johnny walked to center stage directly between Frank and the audience, raised his hand. The band, confused, stopped playing. The silence was sudden and complete. 1,800 people holding their breath. Frank looked confused. "Johnny, everything okay?" Johnny didn't look at Frank. He looked at James, looked directly at the man in the third row who was trying to disappear. And then Johnny said 3 words that changed everything. "Not on my show." Frank laughed nervously. "Come on, Johnny. It's just comedy. The audience loves it." Johnny's voice was calm, but carried clearly through the silent studio. "The audience will laugh at anything if you tell them to. That's not the same as something being funny." He turned to face Frank directly. "That man is a guest in my house. You just made him feel unwelcome in my house. That's not comedy. That's cruelty." Frank's smile faded. He looked at the audience expecting support. Found only uncomfortable silence. "Johnny, I've done this bit 100 times. Nobody's ever complained." Johnny's response was immediate. "That's because nobody with the power to stop you ever cared enough to say something. I care. I'm saying something. You have 2 choices right now. Apologize to that man sincerely and we continue the show. Or don't apologize and leave my stage." The studio was so quiet James could hear his own heartbeat. Frank Dalton was not used to being challenged. He'd built a career on edgy humor, pushed boundaries, gotten away with things because audiences laughed and networks looked the other way. Nobody had ever stopped a show for one of his jokes. Nobody had ever forced him to choose between his pride and his career. "Johnny, come on. Don't make a big deal out of this. It's just a joke." Johnny's voice hardened. "It's never just a joke. Not when someone's dignity is the punchline. That man saved money to be here tonight. Probably worked hard for that suit. Probably watched this show for years dreaming about being in this audience. And you used him. Made him a target so strangers could laugh at him. That's not funny. That's not edgy. That's just mean. And it's not happening on my show." Frank looked at the audience one more time. No one would meet his eyes. The room that had been laughing with him 2 minutes ago was now waiting to see what he would do. His career hung in the balance. Johnny Carson could make or break entertainers with a word. Everyone in show business knew that Frank's face went through several emotions. Anger, disbelief, calculation. Finally, resignation. He turned toward the third row, toward James Monroe, who was sitting frozen in his seat, tears forming in his eyes but refusing to fall. "I'm sorry," Frank said. "It wasn't sincere." Everyone could hear that it wasn't sincere. Johnny could hear it too. "Mean it," Johnny said quietly. "Look at him and mean it." Frank looked at James. Really looked. And something shifted in his expression. Maybe he finally saw what Johnny saw. A man in a good suit who just wanted to have a nice evening. A man who'd done nothing wrong. A man who'd been made to feel small for no reason other than the color of his skin. "I'm sorry," Frank said again. This time it sounded different. "That was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I apologize." James nodded, unable to speak. Johnny walked over to Frank and shook his hand. "Thank you. Now we can continue." But the show never really recovered. The energy was gone. The audience was shaken. Frank finished his set with safe jokes. The edge completely gone from his performance. When he walked off stage, he knew his Tonight Show career was over. Johnny never invited him back. The word spread through Hollywood. Frank Dalton had crossed the line and Johnny Carson had ended him. But the story doesn't end there. After the taping, as the audience filed out, a producer approached James Monroe. "Mr. Carson would like to see you backstage." James couldn't believe it. Followed the producer through corridors he'd only dreamed about into Johnny Carson's dressing room. Johnny was sitting in a chair. Tie loosened, looking tired. He stood when James entered, extended his hand. "I'm sorry that happened to you tonight." James shook Johnny's hand, still not quite believing any of this was real. "You didn't have to do that," James said. "You could have let it go. Everyone else would have." Johnny's response would stay with James for the rest of his life. Everyone else letting it go is exactly the problem. I've been doing this show for 21 years. I've heard jokes like that before. Laughed at some of them to my shame. Looked the other way when I should have spoken up. But tonight, when I saw your face, I couldn't pretend anymore. That could have been anyone. Could have been my son. Could have been someone's father just trying to have a nice night out. And I let it happen in my house. No, not anymore. Johnny asked James about his life, his job, what brought him to Los Angeles. When James explained how he'd saved for 6 months, taken a bus, stayed in a cheap motel just to see The Tonight Show, Johnny looked genuinely moved. You did all that just to be here? James nodded. I've watched your show since I was 19. You got me through some hard times. I just wanted to see it once in person. Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he called his producer over. I want Mr. Monroe to have tickets to any Tonight Show taping he wants for life. And I want them to be the best seats in the house. The producer nodded and made a note. James tried to protest. Johnny stopped him. You came here for a good experience. I owe you one. Actually, I owe you more than one. Let me make it right. James Monroe flew home to Oakland the next day. But something had changed inside him. For the first time in his life, someone with power had stood up for his dignity, had said publicly that he mattered, had refused to let cruelty pass as comedy. That moment planted a seed. Within a year, James Monroe applied to law school. He'd always wanted to be a lawyer, but had talked himself out of it. Too hard, too expensive, not for people like him. But after that night, after seeing what one person's courage could do, James decided he was done talking himself out of things. He graduated law school at 39, became a civil rights attorney. Spent the next 30 years fighting discrimination cases. James Monroe never forgot what Johnny did that night. Never forgot those 3 words, not on my show. He used them often in his own work. When clients asked why he took on cases others wouldn't touch, why he fought battles that seemed unwinnable, James would tell them about the night Johnny Carson stood up. If a man with everything to lose can stop a show for a stranger's dignity, James would say, then I can file one more brief, make one more argument, stand up one more time. Johnny Carson and James Monroe stayed in touch over the years. Not close friends, but connected. James took Johnny up on those lifetime tickets. Attended tapings whenever he was in Los Angeles. Always got the best seats. Always got away from Johnny at some point in the show. When Johnny retired in 1992, James was in the audience for the final taping. And when Johnny died in 2005, James spoke at a memorial event in Oakland. Johnny Carson taught me something that night in 1983. James told the crowd. He taught me that silence is a choice. That looking away is a choice. That every time we let cruelty pass because confronting it is uncomfortable, we're making a choice. Johnny chose differently in front of 1,800 people and millions watching at home. He chose dignity over ease. He chose principle over popularity. He chose a stranger over a career comedian. And that choice mattered. It mattered to me. It changed my life. It taught me that one person in one moment can change everything just by refusing to be silent. Johnny Carson was a comedian, an entertainer, a television legend. But to me, he was the man who saw me. Really saw me. When everyone else in that room saw a punchline, Johnny saw a person. That's his legacy. Not the jokes, not the ratings, the willingness to see people and to stand up for them when it mattered. Frank Dalton's career never recovered. He did small clubs for a few years, then faded from show business entirely. In interviews later, he expressed both bitterness and grudging respect for what Johnny had done. He ended my career over 3 words, Frank said once. But maybe my career needed ending. Maybe I'd been getting away with things for too long. Johnny held up a mirror. I didn't like what I saw. That's not his fault. The footage from October 14, 1983, was not officially preserved. NBC, uncomfortable with the confrontation, did not include it in any retrospectives, but audience members talked. Stories spread. The night Johnny Carson stopped his show to defend a stranger became legend in Hollywood. A reminder that power comes with responsibility. That platforms come with obligations, That sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply say, "Not on my show." If you've ever been silent when you should have spoken up, know that it's never too late to change. Subscribe for more stories about courage in unexpected moments. Share with someone who needs to know that standing up matters, and comment below. Have you ever witnessed someone use their power to defend someone else's dignity? Because Johnny Carson taught us something important that night. You don't have to solve every problem to make a difference. Sometimes all you have to do is refuse to be complicit. Refuse to laugh when something isn't funny. Refuse to look away when someone is being hurt. 3 words. Not on my show. That was Johnny's answer. What's yours?